Hey everybody, it's Trisha with Chocolate Musings. Today I'd like to share a watercolor piece that I painted for someone near and dear to my heart. She came to me and asked me to paint her grandmother's door. She told me it was their happy place. So naturally, I wanted to create something that they could hang inside of their own home as a pleasant reminder of her happy place. She apologized for the lack of color in the reference photos. White on white is what it is, and I don't know how you'll paint it. It's basically the message that I got from her. I used several reference photos and combined them to create a whole new photo. Not really photo. Whole new drawing. One that I could see the welcome mat, the bushes in the front, and the door details. After sketching out the layout lightly in pencil, it's time for the fun part. I started by adding some fresh water to the paper to use the wet on wet technique. This technique works best when there's just enough water on the paper to look shiny, but there's no puddles. I added the first layer of paint, spreading it to the edges so it would settle into the paper evenly. While it was still wet, I added the first layer of shadow along the top left of the door. The shadow color was slowly combined with the door color for a very soft edge. If I were to add more water at this point to the door, it would create watercolor blooms, which are fine if you want those, but that's not the effect I was going for here. I used the door frame as a buffer between the areas of wet on wet painting so that I could paint one area, like the door, and work on a different area, like the siding, while the first area dried. And you will know if an area is completely dry if you touch it and it is no longer cool to the touch. If it's at all cool when you touch it, the paper isn't yet all the way dry, all the way through. I knew that I'd use a lot of Daniel Smith's buff titanium and Payne's gray and watered down raw umber for additional color. I think I tried to sneak in a bit of indigo as well, but it was so watered down, I can't tell you exactly where I put it. Here the door was dry, so I added another layer of shadows to the door around the stained glass half circle window and around the left-hand side. Once the siding area was dry, I added a bit of color with the wreath and the painted flower, just as a starting base for each of those. I want my colors to be very bright and vibrant, so I will need to add a few more layers to really pull out that color. If you want a subtle, muted color, use plenty of water and add minimal layers to your painting. It'll turn out to be more of a pastel color rather than a bright, vibrant color. I don't generally paint realism. That's not my style. It's not something that I've really learned yet. I'm not saying that it could never be my style. What I try and do is try and capture the main feeling of the picture and emphasize the best parts. I also added the base layer for the doormat and the bushes up front. I really emphasized the purple bush out front. I thought it was great for additional color and really created a front porch feel. Although I can't remember the exact combination of colors I used to create the purple, I'm sure it was a combination of Daniel Smith's Amethyst Genuine, Rose of Ultramarine, and Imperial Purple. For the pink wreath and the cute pink painted flower that's hanging beside her door, I use Quinacridone Rose, and then the greens are sap green and a deep sap green. They provide lovely pops of color to break up the monochromatic color scheme. The greens in the wreath, I also used in the green bush next to the stairs. In case you're wondering, I taped down a 5x7 sheet of watercolor paper that I had trimmed from a larger sheet of paper. I think it was Arches that I used for this. And I taped it to an artboard. One reason I like to do this is so that I can move the art piece around. It's not taped directly to my desk. I can move it around while it dries, or if I need to work on something else before it's finished, I can set it aside and then pick it back up when I need to. I add a thin line for the shadow to start showing the lines at the siding. Then I add a bit more shadow to emphasize the railing framing the stairs. To create the soft shadows, I add a bit of water first and then add the paint, moving around the page to paint while other places dry. If you ever add paint in an area that's not quite dry, or you add too much paint, you can often blot it with a paper towel, and you can pick up the paint and excess water so that you can come back and paint again. I did this several times on this painting when the siding got too dark and I needed to remove some of the pigment. Using the dry on dry technique, I add some thin, harder lines around the edges of the railing, the steps, door stoop, and on the door itself. I will have a link to all of the products that I used in the description below. You can also read my blog post, which I will link below. I continue to add layer upon layer of pigment to build up the color. Watercolor always dries lighter than it seems, so your paintings might require more layers than you initially thought. It got a little bit too dark, so I blotted it out with a paper towel to try again since it was still wet. This time I came in with a bit of Payne's Gray using the wet on dry technique and added a bit more paint to the underside of the siding. Because there aren't many dark areas on the door, I decided to really accentuate the stained glass portion of the door at the top. With a dry brush, I used a lot of pigment to outline the diamonds in the glass. It takes me a couple tries to get the look just right. The doormat was a lovely contrast to the purple and the white. I used mostly raw sienna light, and yellow ochre. But I did build up the layers. There's a lot of water in the initial layer, and then I added more and more color as I got more into the painting. I keep adding layers of the same color again on the doormat, the wreath, and the decoration, and the bushes to give a lot of variation to the colors. Once I have some of the shadows painted, I go back and add another layer of paint to the bushes and the decorations by the door. I really think that these bits of color will help with the painting. To paint the bushes, I use a number 6 or number 4 round paintbrush. Then alternating between the tip and the side of the brush, I can create different sized leaves, kind of like a stippling effect. Then with fresh paint, I add some darker lines down the center of the bush to show the stem. Add a bit more pigmented color around the bush for variation. This technique works best if you loosely hold your paintbrush so it's easy to rotate and turn the brush in your hand. Another technique for blending shadows or edges is to use a wet on dry brush so that your paper is dry but your brush is wet enough to hold paint and water. It is not sopping wet. Add the color to your page and then come back with a clean, damp brush and blend the edges. I use the same spotty technique for the bush on the other side, but I must be careful to leave the railing in front. I could have used masking fluid to keep the railing perfectly white, but it didn't end up being a big deal, and since I didn't use the masking fluid, I could paint the shadows on the railing while the other parts of the painting dried. Since there's a glass storm door in front of the main door, I added a bit of blue with kind of diagonal marks across the door. This is a pretty typical way to show glass or a window. It took me several tries to get the look and technique down. And just so you know, blue is usually a staining color, meaning if you try and lift up the paint off with a paintbrush or a paper towel, not all of the color will lift away. So you want to be careful how much you try and lift away the blue. I had a lot of water mixed in, so it lifted pretty well. I certainly didn't want harsh lines, so I used the wet on dry technique and blended out the lines. For a little sparkle and to finish off the details for the doorknob and the stained glass surrounding, I used a little Dr. P.H. Martin's iridescent copper plate gold. It's the right consistency to paint with, and it's one of my very favorite gold paints. A few more added shadows on the banister, and then I'll add a bit of color to the underside of the roof. The color up there might have been a bit of a stretch. It was more gray than brown from the pictures, but adding a bit of Payne's gray helped tone down the brown. Now for the exciting part, the tape reveal. And it came out perfectly. I hope you've gotten some ideas and painting tips from this little project of mine. White on white doesn't mean there isn't any color. It's just choosing the right colors to show the shadows. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd love to hear any tips or techniques that you have. Hit the subscribe button, and I will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.